Well, hello YouTube. In the second video of this series on lumberjack efficiency, I want to answer the question how often you should rebuild lumber camps. In a video made by Spirit of the Law a few years ago, he compared not rebuilding your lumber camp with rebuilding lumber camps frequently. His main point is correct. Although rebuilding lumber camps is an investment, by rebuilding lumber camps you can keep a constant efficiency over time, whereas you lose efficiency when not rebuilding them. However, he showed with his test setup that the investment into new lumber camps starts to pay off only by the time the gap between the lumber camp and the wood line is around 5 or 6 tiles. He concludes that this is the time around which you should think of rebuilding your lumber camp. If you watch pros like the Viper, you will notice that they rebuild lumber camps way more frequently than this advice suggests. Someone called Age of Numbers already reacted with his own video a few years ago, in which he claimed that you should build your new lumber camp when there is a 3-tile cap. Links of the mentioned videos are in the description. Today I will show you that Spirit of the Law's advice for rebuilding the lumber camp is far from optimal. One of the reasons for this is that he compared two extreme cases, and he was quite sloppy in the placement of new lumber camps. Another thing that skewed the results is that he had 15 villagers working on a single lumber camp, which is a bit much. And a high number of lumberjacks has the effect that the efficiency drops later than when you have fewer lumberjacks, which is something I already showed in a previous video. Splitting villagers over multiple wood lines is in general a good idea, but then you are basically splitting up the problem into two separate tests. And in that case, you would preferably also want to investigate in how many groups to split your lumberjacks. Instead, I decided to focus on testing a single group of lumberjacks working at a single lumber camp, so I chose for a more modest group of 8 lumberjacks. I ran a few scenarios in which I kept rebuilding a single lumber camp, varying only the spacing between subsequent lumber camps. I ran each scenario for well over an hour to ensure that I could capture the long-term efficiency accurately. I'll show you some of the footage while I explain the test setup in further detail. You currently see the scenario in which the lumber camp is rebuilt as soon as there is a 1-tile gap. In this scenario, the current lumber camp always needs to be deleted first before the new one can be constructed. So it makes sense to rebuild it using all 8 villagers, to prevent villagers from walking away to another drop-off point. In the 2-tile gap scenario, I rebuilt the lumber camp using 4 villagers, for a 3-tile gap with 3 villagers, and for a 4 or 5-tile gap with 2 villagers. Constructing a building with fewer villagers is more efficient, since any additional villagers construct only half as fast as the first one. It seemed natural to rebuild the lumber camp with fewer villagers when the gap was larger, since the lumberjacks are spread over a larger area then, and you typically would select the villagers that are around the location where you want to build the new lumber camp, and build it with those selected villagers. I ran this test with double bit axe, bow saw, and wheelbarrow researched, which is reasonable for a typical castle age situation. As you can see in this sheet, I measured the time it takes to consume a tree with a single villager for different sets of upgrades. And from that I computed the percentage of time that the lumberjack spent walking. I chose a tree on 2 tiles walking distance, but this is not really important, since I'm not interested in the walking percentages per se, but I'm only interested in how this percentage changes for different eco upgrades, such that I can make a reasonable choice of eco upgrades for my test. As you can see, the lumber camp upgrades reduce only the chopping time, thus increasing the walking percentage. Whereas the town center upgrades lower the walking percentage mainly by increasing the carry capacity. The walking percentage is important, because it determines both how much the efficiency changes when the walking distance changes, and how much bumping is to be expected between lumberjacks. So by picking the combination of double bit axe, wheelbarrow and bow saw for my test, we get a 15% walking time, which is a nicely representative value for the first 30 minutes of a typical game, which is the part of the game for which avoiding wrong decisions is most important. Throughout each scenario, the efficiency changes all the time, and each time a lumbercamp is rebuilt, 100 wood is invested. In order to produce smooth and fair measurements, I chose to write down the amount of wood in the bank and the timestamp each time the construction of a new lumbercamp just finished. By doing it this way, we take our points of measurement in a very consistent way over the varying scenarios. The number and location of measurement points then differs per scenario, as you can see from this Excel sheet, but using a line scatter plot we can still visualize this nicely. In order to zoom in and enlarge the differences, I replaced the total amount of wood in the measurement points by the amount of wood relative to the expected amount of wood that we would have when the villagers would collect 27 wood per villager per minute, which results in this representation. The higher the graph, the better it is. As you can see, the 3-tile gap scenario performs the best. It is the top line. A bit below that, we see the 4-tile gap scenario performing a bit better than the 2-tile gap scenario. The scenarios with a gap of 1 and 5 tiles are the worst, with the 1-tile gap performing way worse than all the other scenarios. The differences for 2, 3 and 4-tile gaps are rather modest. After an hour of chopping with 8 villagers, the 3-tile gap scenario ends up with about 250 wood more in the bank than the 4-tile gap scenario, and the 2-tile gap scenario is another 200 wood below that. You also see that the lines are not completely straight. That is likely due to the fact that sometimes a villager would get stuck between 2 other villagers at random points in all the scenarios. By now, you might be wondering what the cyan line is, that is named 3+ tile gap. Well, based on the first 5 scenarios, I concluded that the optimal gap would likely be slightly above 3 tiles. So I ran another test, in which I rebuilt the lumbercamp 3 tiles further forward again, but also 1 tile to the side, which means the villagers will have to chop a few trees more before the lumbercamp is rebuilt. Effectively, this scenario lies in between the 3-tile and 4-tile scenario. This cyan line is the graph for this intermediate scenario. It lies slightly below the 3-tile gap scenario, but it clearly outperforms the other scenarios. The difference between the top 2 lines stays about equal between 2000 and 4500 seconds into the experiment. So the difference that occurred might be fully due to the randomness of villagers getting stuck, so we can't really appoint a definitive winner. Although the legend shows the graphs in order using nicely shifting colors, the order of the actual graphs is quite messed up. Luckily, we can derive an even simpler plot to show the most important results clearly. We can take out the progression over time and instead compute the average amount of wood collected per villager per minute for each scenario, which results in this simple graph. Now we have a nice band of colors with the gap sizes in order, and we can clearly see that the wood collection rate increases towards the 3-tile gap scenario and then starts to fall slowly and then faster and faster when the gap size increases further. This plot makes clear that rebuilding lumbercamps too frequently results in a significant penalty, whereas rebuilding it slightly too late is not that big of a deal. As said already, I ran this test with 8 villagers. In my previous video I already showed that the drop in efficiency is smaller when you have more lumberjacks on a single wood line. So, if you have many more than 8 villagers on a wood line, then the optimal gap would be a bit larger. And with fewer villagers, the optimal gap is slightly smaller. However, I expect that the advice to rebuild on a 3-tile gap is the right choice in all common cases. To explain this shortly, on the 3-tile gap scenario, the villagers collected about 2200 wood per lumbercamp. If you rebuild on a 2 or 4-tile gap instead, the difference in the amount of wood chopped per lumbercamp changes with about 40%, which is due to the fact that the amount of trees around the lumbercamp is proportional to the square of the gap size. So a small change in gap size means a relatively large change in the amount of wood chopped per lumbercamp. An edge case that we didn't discuss yet is, wait for it, the Japanese. Japanese lumbercamps only cost 50 wood instead of 100, which reduces the investment costs of rebuilding your lumbercamps. My test runs would have gone exactly the same if I would have picked Japanese instead of Magyars, except for saving 50 wood per lumbercamp rebuild. So I can simply take the same Excel sheet, but then add 50 to the wood count in the second data row, 100 to the third row, 150 to the fourth row, etc. Then I update the computed efficiencies and voila! We have a similar plot for the Japanese. The first thing to note is that the general shape is the same, with the optimum still lying at the 3-tile gap scenario. All efficiencies lie higher than for the generic civilization, but scenarios with smaller gap sizes benefit more, because in those scenarios we rebuild more lumber camps. The efficiency for the 1-tile gap scenario has increased by almost 1.8 wood per villager per minute. For the 2-tile gap scenario, the efficiency is roughly 0.9 higher. The optimal scenario of the 3-tile gap lies about 0.6 higher, and for the larger gaps the difference is even smaller. In general, all conclusions we drew for generic civilizations also apply to the Japanese, but with the side note that rebuilding a lumber camp too early is not punished that hard. Rebuilding for a 2-tile gap is now even slightly more efficient than rebuilding on a 4-tile gap. So, to wrap up this video, the main conclusion is that for optimal wood collection, you should be rebuilding your lumber camp when the wood line situation looks like this, or something like this. And when in doubt, or when you desperately need your wood for something else at the moment, then know that delaying a new lumber camp a little more is not that bad at all. That's all for this video. Thank you for watching, and I hope you enjoyed it.